Chapter 4. Beggars on the floor, travelers o'er the bridge. She preened before the mirror in her chamber, running her hands down her lightly clad body, liking what she saw, what she felt. Riverstar Sunsore was a lovely, alluring birdwoman, and she knew it. What man had ever been able to resist her? She lifted her hands to her fine golden curls and shook them out. How they complimented her violet eyes, her pale skin. "I am irresistible," she said, then laughed low and husky. Irresistible indeed, except to the one who continually resisted her. She froze at a subtle touch. Power. His. It stroked at her arms, lifted the material from her breasts, rippled down over her belly, her legs. Her lover was close. She did not move, pretending not to notice. She would make him beg. She would. Except he never begged. Always she ended on the floor before him, her hands clinging to his legs, her golden wings spread out in appeal behind her, begging him to bed her. She would writhe before him, sobbing and shrieking, until he had her so completely in his power that she would scream her gratitude when he finally lifted her and threw her to the mattress. Riverstar frowned at her reflection. She did not like to have to beg, but oh gods, how could she withstand him when his power stroked her, caressed her, penetrated her? As it did now, she shuddered, tears filling her eyes, and when he opened the door and entered the chamber, she fell to the floor and begged, begged, begged. "You are unlike any other," she whispered into his ear when it was finally done and they lay sweat-tangled amid the sheets. "None." "I was made for a purpose," he said, smiling, and kissed her brow. "Let me stand by your side as your lover," she said. "Please, let all see how good we are together." "No." "Why not?" she screamed, hate for him contorting her beautiful face. "Why not? You can do anything you—" His hand caught her face, his fingers digging deep, hurting so badly she whimpered. "You will tell no one about us," he hissed. "No one. Do you understand?" Yes, she whispered. "I will tell no one. Never tell. No, please love me again. Please, please, please." Zenith stopped in her chambers to change into a vivid robe and give her face and hair a cursory check in the mirror. Salem was right. It was time she left Sigholt for a while. She'd been thinking much the same thing, thus her reaction when Salem had verbalized the unspoken thoughts that had consumed her for almost a week. Something was wrong. She couldn't say what, or even what it might be related to, only that for the past few days a feeling of formless dread had been growing in her. Dread. A sense of loss so deep that for 3 nights in a row she'd woken drenched in sweat, her hands clawing at the sheets. Thus the reason she'd been wandering about Sigholt so late at night. These nightmares reminded her of those she'd had when she was much younger. Nights when she'd woken screaming, nights when the only way she'd agree to go back to sleep was sandwiched between the comfort of her parents. Axis had always questioned her closely about the dreams, but Zenith could never remember their details. Maybe didn't want to remember. And Azure had refused to let Axis use the Song of Recall to summon them from her murky subconscious. "Leave the child be," her mother would say softly, stroking the hair back from Zenith's brow. "She doesn't need to remember them, only to be reassured of our love." And somehow that love had helped Zenith through. The dreams had begun to fade when she was 18 or 19, and were gone completely by the time she'd reached her majority. Although there was still the problem of the lost hours. This was something she'd never told her parents about. Why, she could not say. But some days she would suddenly find herself in a distant part of Sigholt, or even in a nearby valley of the Urquhart Hills, and have no knowledge of how she had arrived there. Hours, sometimes even half a day, would have been lost to her. These episodes had also lessened as she grew older, but Zenith still had 1 or 2 a year. And in the past week, 3. This was the reason she'd hesitated when Salem had suggested she go to Carlon. What if she lost herself somewhere in Spiredor and come to her senses sitting on an ice floe in the Escuril Ocean? How would she explain that to Salem? How could she explain it to herself? Zenith hesitated in the center of her chamber, a stunningly beautiful, slim birdwoman robed in scarlet that contrasted vividly with the darkness of her wings and hair. Taking a huge breath, Zenith tried to calm her nerves, wrapping herself so deep with magic it literally blurred the outlines of her figure. An image formed before her, her grandfather, Stardrifter. It was a memory only, not the actual person. Stardrifter lived far south on the island of Mist and Memory, devoted to his duties among the priestess of the Temple Mount. This was a memory that Zenith had carried with her for some 30 years, a memory of a day when she'd been staying with her grandfather on the island and had found herself wandering the southern cliff faces of the Temple Mount with no idea how she'd got there. She'd been young then, and she'd been growing her wings only a year. They'd still felt strange to her, and she fumbled on her infrequent flights, so that suddenly coming to awareness at the crumbling edge of a 1,000-pace drop had been terrifying. She'd screamed, sure she was going to die, and then Stardrifter was there, wrapping her in his arms and wings, pulling her back, holding her and singing to her and telling her she was safe, safe, safe. From that moment on, Zenith had adored Stardrifter, treasured him beyond the usual love of a granddaughter for her grandfather. Now she recalled the image of Stardrifter, his beautiful face full of love, a gentle hand cupping her chin so he could look in her eyes. "I'll always be there to catch you," he'd said. "I'll always be there for you." "Always," Zenith whispered, and the image faltered and then faded. Very pretty. She whirled about, furious that anyone should have seen the vision. Drago was leaning nonchalantly against the doorway that led into her private washroom. His thin face was unreadable, his eyes narrowed, his arms carefully folded across his chest. A towel was tucked over one arm, and Zenith noticed that Drago's coppery hair was damp and newly combed back into its tail at the nape of his neck. "Why not use your own chambers to wash?" she snapped. "I'd been down in the stables," he said, standing up straight and throwing the towel back inside the washroom, "helping Stephane with the grey mare. She foaled tonight. Difficult birth." "But that doesn't excuse why. I would have used my own chambers, save that Salem is stamping and striding about the upper floor corridors, and frankly the last thing I needed tonight was to run into him. So I thought I'd ask you if I could use your washroom. You weren't here, so..." He shrugged, walking over to stand before Zenith. "I heard you come in just as I was finishing up. If you're concerned, I didn't stand and watch you change. I may be many things, sister mine, but I am not a voyeur." "Yet you saw my memory of Stardrifter." "I thought I heard his voice. It made me come to the door. Zenith, I like him too, remember?" Zenith was rapidly losing her temper, which, truth be told, was mainly a product of her shock, and Drago did like Stardrifter. She was unsure about many things regarding Drago, but his genuine feeling for Stardrifter was not one of them. As a child, Drago had enjoyed his months with Stardrifter almost as much as she had. For some reason, Stardrifter had been able to reach the uncommunicative youth in a way that Axis and Azure never could. Or never could be bothered to. She looked at her brother, and for an instant emotion threatened to choke her. What could he have grown into if he had been given love instead of rejection? Their parents had, if not ignored him, then favored all the other children before him. His punishment for plotting against Salem had left him with little of his rich Ikari heritage. His coppery hair still thick but kept pulled back into its tight tail, and his violet eyes, although they had faded with age. Against his vivid and powerful siblings, he was just a thin, rather plain man, age and frustrated life marking his face with deep lines. Drago had done wrong, no one could deny that. But Zenith often wished that her mother could have not found some other way to punish him that would not have resulted in the destruction of so much potential, the annihilation of so many dreams. She caught herself before Drago thought to ask why she took so long to respond. Well, if you don't want to run into Salem, and he is in a fearful temper, then you can use my bed for the night. Drago arched an inquiring eyebrow. Briefly, Zenith told him of what she and Salem had learned. And so now, good girl that you are, you go to the Star Sun's bidding. Drago yawned theatrically. Well, off you go now. The bed does look inviting. Not trusting her temper, Zenith stalked over to the door. Just as she reached it, Drago said softly, "That was a beautiful memory you conjured up into the flesh. Zenith, I wish I had that skill." Zenith turned and stared at him, not knowing how to take his words. Was he expressing resentment that he no longer had the power to do similar feats? Or was he expressing genuine regret? But Drago gave her no clue. He dropped across the bed, his face away from her, and so Zenith left the room, not knowing whether to feel sorry for him or angry. By the time Zenith reached the courtyard, Drago had slipped far from her mind. Instead, she felt the first tingle of excitement. It was good to get away, even if only for a day or so. The guards at the massive gate in Sigholt's walls nodded to her, and then Zenith was through and on the short space of roadway leading to the bridge that guarded Sigholt's entrance. "A good evening to you, bridge," she called softly as she stepped onto its cobbled carriageway. "And a good evening to you, Zenith," the bridge said in her deep, melodious voice. No one ever understood the bridge, what she truly was, or what magic had created her. She simply existed, and her sole purpose in her existence was to guard all entrances into Sigholt. All visitors, whether by foot, hoof, or air, were challenged by the bridge as to whether they were true or not. No one ever knew what she really meant by that either, but the bridge generally kept Sigholt safe, apart from the one notable exception when the infant Drago had tricked her into allowing Gorgrail access to Sigholt. And she was good company for nights when sleep refused to come. "Do you wish to pass an hour or so with me, Zenith?" the bridge asked hopefully. Even so great a creation as the bridge still liked to gossip whenever the opportunity presented itself. "No, bridge, I am sorry. Tonight I must go to Spiredor. Can you lead me there?" "Of course. Where are you going?" "Carlon." "Ah," the bridge sighed. "I have heard many wondrous tales about Carlon. But wait. There, Spiredor awaits you." Zenith looked across the bridge. Normally it led to the roadway that ran the length of the Holdhard Pass, but now the other side of the bridge connected into a misty blue tunnel at the end of which Zenith could see the stairway of Spiredor. "I thank you, friend bridge," she said, and stepped across. If the bridge was unknown magic, then Spiredor was 100 times the puzzlement and even more the magic. The tower that stood on the opposite shoreline of Grail Lake to Carlon belonged to Azure, although it was as ancient, some whispered, as Grail Lake itself. Its interior was a maze of seemingly disconnected stairwells and corridors, but if one knew how to use Spiredor's magic, those stairwells and corridors could take you just about anywhere you wished. Azure had taught all her children, save Drago of course, how to use the tower and how particularly to enter via the bridge at Sigholt. Now Zenith stepped off the bridge and into the short corridor of blue mist that led to the interior of Spiredor. As powerful and knowledgeable an enchanter as she was, all Zenith understood of this process was that somehow the bridge had called across the scores of leagues separating her from Spiredor, and the tower itself had reached out and formed this connection. From the misty corridor Zenith entered Spiredor at one of its myriad balconies. Glancing quickly up and down, she saw a bizarre outcropping of disconnected balconies and stairs, and even some ladders, that lined the circular interior of the tower. None of them appeared to go anywhere. "Spiredor," she said firmly, "I wish to go to Carlon." and she walked to the nearest stairwell and stepped down. Azure had always impressed on her 2 winged daughters that they must never fly in Spiredor, as it was so strangely magical they might easily become disoriented and crash into a balcony, or even the floor of the tower. Zenith walked until she felt her calves begin to ache, and then, just as she paused to rub them, she saw that around the next curve of the stairs was a flat floor. Zenith smiled to herself. It was ever so in Spiredor. Just when you thought you could go no farther, Spiredor delivered you to your destination. Once on the floor, Zenith saw a door before her, and through the door was the dawning air about Grail Lake, the harsh cries of the lake birds filling the air as they rose to meet the sun. "I thank you, Spiredor," she said as she passed through, closing the door gently behind her. Outside, the tower looked plain, even though it imposed with its height, completely windowless. It climbed some 100 paces into the crimson sky, the sun ascending almost directly behind it. Zenith stood motionless for long minutes, drinking in the view of the tower, the lake, the stunning city rising on the far shore. "How wrong I have been to secrete myself in Sigholt," she whispered, then sprang into the air with a glad cry, her arms wide as if to embrace the entire world. Leah was sitting at her mirror table, brushing the tangles from her hair and trying to stop yawning. There was a rush at the window, as if it had been struck by a great gust of air, and then a small, pale fist was tapping impatiently on the panes of glass. "Leah!" a muffled voice called. "Leah, let me in!" Leah sat and stared for long minutes, unable to believe what she saw, before she finally roused herself enough to walk over and open the windows. Zenith almost fell through, enveloping her friend in a great hug. "Leah! Leah! You and Askham are to come to Sigholt. Can you believe it?" Leah just stared at her. "And Zared is to be there too. Come, Sleepy Eyes, what shall you wear?" Zenith did not think it wrong to give Leah a day of hope and excitement, and it was true. After at least 2 years, Leah would finally see Zared again.